Okay, we've studied a lot of dimensions of international management in the last 5 weeks. We talked about political issues that exist in various parts of the world, in various countries, and the importance of understanding the political aspect, the economic aspect, and the social aspect of what's going on. We also, in chapter 3, we took a very interesting excursion through understanding culture and the importance of that. In fact, you've had discussion board topics on culture. And I think I indicated in the first couple sessions that we had that culture really determines whether we're going to be successful. Understanding culture determines whether we're going to be successful in the work we do as international managers. Understanding culture, being able to discern what's going on with individuals as we interact with them in international management situations are going to be critical. So that chapter, and the reason why I put 2 discussion board topics on that was that its importance is tremendous. So we've also talked about communication and culture. Communication, how we speak, how we talk, and how words and sentences and paragraphs and narratives are very important and how they're presented. That becomes the foundation upon which this whole aspect of international management is established. And then today we're going to talk about this important topic of cross-cultural negotiation and decision making. We've had those 4 weeks of foundation pieces that should start putting this together in terms of understanding what the reality is. So today we're going to talk about how to prepare for business negotiations in a cross-cultural situation. And we're also going to talk about the need to develop this trusting relationship. And of all the elements of this, the trusting relationship is so critically important. Back in the early 80s when we had the negotiation with the Soviet Union about arms and nuclear weapons and stuff, there was a president called Ronald Reagan who said, we have to trust but verify. Trust is critically important, but sometimes we have to be able to understand what that really means. We have to verify individuals' ideas about this. Be aware of culturally based behavioral differences, values. These are so important, and sometimes they're missed. And when they're missed, sometimes we have a real problem with the whole aspect of getting over the relationship trust issue. And if we don't get over any negatives to that, then we're never going to be able to make any decisions. We're never going to negotiate. And then talk about the complexity of negotiation with, in fact, the Chinese. Very difficult to negotiate. They're hard bargainers. They're very focused, very disciplined, and always do their homework. And then become familiar with Japanese decision-making process. But we're going to give you the steps here, and you're going to be able to think about these and use them as we move along. The opening profile gave us some sense of what this conflict and negotiation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time dealing with that. You can read about it and see what the principles are, and then as we move through the particular platform that I'm going to present to you, then you can see how this really act out in real life. Learn how to prepare for cultural negotiations. As you come to class, it's important to prepare for the class so that when you come in and I ask you questions, you'll be able to respond rather than say, oh, I don't know. In a negotiation in business, if you haven't done your homework and you haven't gone to the next mile or the next extra steps in getting yourself ready intellectually, pragmatically, and emotionally, then you're not gonna succeed, and it's going to be a disaster. So preparation is critically important. Negotiation by global man. Specific plans and strategies. What is in fact the strategy that is going to be used by the managers in dealing with it? You have to think about that ahead of time. And not only one strategy, but what happens if the first strategy doesn't work or the second strategy? How are you going to recover from that? So that's critically important, that you have some level of understanding of how you're going to approach this and focus on it. Like in a football game, we talk about having a pass game. That strategy is we're going to pass, or we're going to run the ball. And in the negotiation, you have to have, are you really going to be hard-nosed and not move on any of the issues? Or are you going to have some degrees of freedom in terms of negotiation adaptability? Maybe faced with negotiating with a government-owned company. We call them state-owned enterprises, SOEs, state-owned enterprises. In that particular situation, those state-owned enterprises have a different bureaucracy. They have a different structure, different culture. And to understand what that particular culture is has an impact upon how you're going to negotiate. And managers must prepare operational details that are going to be negotiated. What are, in fact, the items that are going to be negotiated? A, B, C, D. Or are there other things that have an impact upon those A, B, C, and D? What specifically are they? And decision-making processes that relate to all of this are really, really important. Negotiation. Here's a definition. I'd be very, very concerned about you knowing this. You may see this on an exam. You may see this in a variety of situations. And the foundation of learning particular principles is to understand what definitions are. So here's a very concise idea. The process of discussion by which two or more parties aim, and the key word here is to mutually acceptable agreements. Mutually acceptable agreements, where they aim to have some meeting of the minds, have some integration of ideas, and a give and take. It's a trade-off, all right? Mutually acceptable agreements, all right? Important differences, the amount and type of preparation. If we're dealing with very complex engineering issues related to particular parts or particular machinery or particular types of information technology, they may be very complex, and hence there has to be some sense of detail. Task and interpersonal relationship. My experience with negotiation is that even in the first initial stages, there has to be the establishment of a good interpersonal relationship. You can talk with each other. There has to be some levity in some cases where you negotiate in a stern way and disciplined way, but you have to have some levity also. General principles and specific ideas. General principles of negotiation. We both want to get a good deal, but how do we get there without destroying each other? And we do it in a civil way. And a number of people present and their influence. Most of the time, in many situations, the lead CEO of a company does not negotiate particular contracts. Some do, but in many situations, mostly the subordinate individuals, middle managers negotiate the contract, negotiate the deals, negotiate the particular principles that have to be developed. So here's some of the Venn diagram relationships between the stakeholders. And we have talked quite repeatedly about what stakeholders mean, so I'm not going to go into a heavy-duty discussion of that. I just want to show you the relationships that exist there. You know, the home country, headquarters, the firm negotiators, and the host country. And the firm negotiators are in the middle. They have to represent the relationship of their constituency and the people who they believe are part of the decision-making process. So each side has a stakeholder that they have to satisfy. And you can see there's a whole host of them, and how that particular constituency is satisfied is critically important. Recognize the need to build trusting relationships. I think I have repeated that over and over and over. Understanding the culture, which we talked about in chapter 3, will be very helpful in this particular exercise. Knowing what the sensitive parts of their culture are, knowing that it's not nice to do certain things, and making sure that they have some level of understanding that they can trust you in this exercise of negotiation, right? So here are the really the 5 elements, or the 5 pieces. 1 is preparation, 2 is relationship building. That's always being done all the time, some type of networking relation. Exchange task-related information, persuasion, and then the other part here, concessions and agreements. So we have 5 elements. 5 elements. Preparation, establishing a relationship, constant exercise. The exchange of task-related information, that is, what relates to the specific items in the process of negotiation. That is, what are the elements we're negotiating about? Is it the software in the technology, or is it the technology together with the software? That is, the hardware and the software, or are we just negotiating the software? That would have to be developed, and information related that have to be presented. Persuasion, very difficult in some situations. How do you persuade people that in fact what you're presenting and that your side of the equation is really beneficial? And in selling, the biggest element of that is selling the benefits. What are the benefits that they're going to get out of the results or the takeaway that this particular negotiated process gets? How are they going to benefit? If they don't get as much as you do, then negotiations are going to be problematic. And last, in almost all negotiations, there's some type of trade-off. Somebody has to give up something in order to get what they want. Very, very few negotiation situations are without concessions. So if we look at the preparation piece, we have to think about it in about 3 different components. 1 is developing a profile of the counterpart. That is the individual. Who are they? What are they? How are they coming to this particular negotiated situation? Are they forced to come here, or do they come in a situation of civil dialogue? Who are they? How prepared are they? What are their credentials? What is their history? What have they done in the past? And those profiles can give a lot of insight into how they're going to negotiate. Find out likely demands, team composition, and counterpart authority. What's going on in terms of the group that's being sent to negotiate? What is their dynamics? Or do they have a dynamic relationship with each other? Do they have one individual in the group who is the key person that has to be convinced, or you have to convince everybody? What is the team dynamic? And lastly, choose a negotiation site where it's comfortable for everybody. And some of this is psychological in terms of, well, we're on your turf and hence you have an advantage. Probably should be a neutral environment where there's no notion of any unfairness or there's any bias related to that at all. That's really, really important. All right. The second one is relationship building. And everybody knows what that is. Anybody who is in a married situation knows what relationship building is. Anybody who is trying to establish a relationship in social settings knows what that's all about. It's this issue of mutual trust. And it's difficult to measure. Generally, you know what mutual trust is once you've been able to achieve it. But it's very difficult to measure, and you have to feel it. It's a feeling that you have among people. It's non-task sounding. Sometimes it's important to have what we call an intermediary, some type of a broker who knows one culture and knows the other culture, both cultures, very, very thoroughly, and is able to bring the individuals together by showing them common ground, common ideas, common understanding of those. And they can mediate some of the rough edges that exist in terms of establishing relationships. Thirdly, exchanging task-related information. Now, we don't want to give too much out, but we don't want to give out not enough so that the individuals have a poor understanding of what really is happening in this negotiation or the items. So there has to be what we call a quid pro quo, something for something. And these cultural differences have an impact upon the task-related information. For example, the French enjoy debate and conflict. Mexicans can be suspicious and indirect, and the Chinese ask many questions but provide ambiguous information in return. Those are really elements that one has to be really aware of. If they ask a lot of questions but they don't give you really good straight answers, then you have to be a little bit more circumspect, a little bit more understanding of what really is happening in this situation, and it may change the negotiation style and decision. And the last piece of this, show understanding of other point of view, rather than say, that's a bunch of baloney, or that's a stupid comment that you made, or that's a stupid idea. Rather than talk in those particular negative terms, it's important to think about what their point of view is, and take it into your mind and say, hey, that's what they think about it. Maybe I would appreciate it if they would take what I believe in terms of this particular negotiated situation, and they appreciate my point of view. So it has to be, again, a quid pro quo, something for something, and both points of view on this have to be understood. They have to be appreciated. They don't have to always be accepted, but they have to be appreciated, and they have to each party has to understand where they come from. The fourth element here is the most difficult, in my opinion. Dirty tricks are in the eyes of the beholder. Persuasion. How do you persuade people? What are the key elements that you can get across to them that they say, I really like this and I want to buy into it. This issue of false information, ambiguous authority, nonverbal messages, and the issue of individualism versus collectivism. Are we going to have to convince a group, or we have to persuade a group of people before we get any type of final deal? Or do we have to understand that this ambiguity is a strategy that's being used, and hence we have to overcome that ambiguity in order to persuade them to accept our point of view? These are very difficult to deal with, and one has to study them, has to think about them much more profoundly, and has to really have some level of skill to overcome the specificity of that. So this persuasion variable is really at the heart of the reason why establishing mutual trust is so critically important. It's very, very difficult, almost impossible to persuade anybody unless you have their mutual trust. And then the fifth one, the concessions. In this particular case, we see the Russians and Chinese start with extreme positions, and I've seen that in other environments where you go way out to the extreme side and then try to whittle it down to where both people can agree on it. Russians and Chinese start at extreme position. The Swedes start at what they will accept. And sometimes that becomes a contentious point of view. Starting with extremes may be effective, but it may also have real problems depending upon how long you want to deliberate on a particular extreme, and how long it would take you to get from the extremes to where both sides can agree on something. Linear versus holistic. Do we just want to go down one path, that linear straight line, or are there whole pieces of this that can be put together rather than just one linear path? And one has to think about, is it linear? That will be part of the analysis of what are the pieces of the negotiation in terms of the specific product, the specific site, the specific proposal that is being put on the table. And then the last one, importance of contracts. Contracts. If in fact, when there's an agreement made, we like to put it into writing. We have to have some signature to, yes, I agree with this, yes, I agree with that. But really, we have to be very understanding that even if we have written documents, it's possible. It's very possible, and I've seen it in several situations, that people won't agree, won't stick to the particular agreement. They will, in fact, violate that particular written agreement. So there's no absolute 100% guarantee that even if you get it in writing, that it's going to be absolute. So there are so many dimensions to this, and so many possible complications, that you have to take it step by step, be thorough, be disciplined, and make sure that we have a good relationship with the people we're doing business in. Here's the cultural situation, the misunderstanding that related in a joint venture, and because of the way it was negotiated with the individuals, we see that there was a lot of the issues related to persuasion, related to mutual trust, related to understanding what the profiles of these particular individuals were. And then the lessons learned from this particular vignette or a small case: cultural misunderstandings, cross-cultural misunderstandings, and unfamiliarity with the JV partners. They didn't do good due diligence and research on the profiles of those particular individuals they were negotiating with. Hence, they didn't understand what was going on. Both companies use media and PR companies instead of having open negotiation. Sometimes it's good to have intermediaries, but if you don't have something that makes sure that everybody is included and that there is this artificial environment with 2 or 3 pieces that are really not totally connected with the source or the home operation, get into this. The third, the relationship building exchange of information is critical. Relationship building, we talk about it over and over and over. Understanding the culture, understanding who the people are, and how you're going to establish that relationship in a way that's going to be open, disciplined, and caring about getting the job done. And there's a lack of open communication in day-to-day management. Sharing of communication, probably one of the biggest issues that all businesses have, that sometimes really creates significant problems among individuals, among the decision-making process, is the fact that there's a miscommunication. And I know from experience, people say, "Oh, I misunderstood what you meant. I thought you meant something else." And they don't take the time to really understand what really is said. What are really the dimensions of this? What really are the elements that are going to make it or break this? And if they don't understand that, then we get into this particular situation. And the last one here is, in JV's relationship building, takes time and a good amount of interaction between partners. It could take a year to get a good relationship going before you can even get into the negotiation process, to get to know people very intensely. And that is something that is not really taught through a textbook. It's not taught through going to classes. You can get some overview, but you have to really work at it. As you know, in a marriage situation, you have to work at that. Communication, understanding points of view, give and take. You know? So here are some interesting comparisons. You know, the Japanese, the North Americans, and the Latin Americans. Understanding the styles, understanding how they see the world in relationship to their situation in the negotiating process. For example, the Japanese, they hide their emotions. They hide their emotions. Subtle power plays. You never know what's going to happen, so you have to be alert to all kinds of possible subtle situations. Step-by-step approach. Very disciplined. We have to get this done before we can move on to step number 2. Can't do step number 2 or 3 until we get finished step number 2. And group good is the aim. Not just individual. Not that Joe Blow here, who is the chief negotiator, that he's satisfied. Everybody in the group has to be satisfied. Everybody has to buy into it. Everybody has to give their consent to this particular step. North Americans deal impersonally. They're not really concerned about the personalities. They just want the final product that comes from this particular negotiation. What is the final deal? That's the product. They don't care about it. Litigation, not conciliation. If you're not going to play ball, then we'll litigate. You know? We see that quite extensively in the U.S. There's a lot of action in courts, civil cases especially, litigate a variety of lawsuit here, lawsuit there, lawsuit all over. Let a mediator deal with that. And methodological organization, generally North Americans are pretty understanding of the particular methods that have to be used in certain negotiating situations. So they have a method for doing one type of negotiation, they have another method for doing another type of negotiation, and a third method and maybe more for a third type. And then the last one, profit is the aim. North Americans live in a capitalistic society. Profit is the driver, the engine of all business organizations. If you don't make a profit, then really we shouldn't be in business. And therefore, if this agreement, this negotiated agreement that we come to doesn't provide the sufficient level of profit, then really it's an exercise in futility. As compared to Latin Americans, emotionally passionate, you could see that. In most Latins, they're pretty passionate about a particular concept, and they will be very articulate, very verbal, very empathetic with the issue that they're dealing with. Great power plays. They may have a strategy that says we're going all out for this particular situation. And they are willing to gamble. They're willing to put certain items on the line that are large, they're big, and they're powerful, and they may move in that direction. Impulsive and spontaneous. You have to be very careful that you don't have a situation where they just erupt and disagree or agree in a spontaneous way, and that sometimes is surprising, and it sometimes destabilizes the negotiating relationship. Group and individual goal is the aim. They're able to deal with either one, either the group or the individual, but that has to be preset before they get into the meeting. And it may change based upon what's going on in the negotiation process. So one has to know exactly what is really going on. Successful negotiators, Americans, know when to compromise. It's critically important. But stand firm at the beginning, accept compromise only when there's a deadlock. Because if there's a deadlock, you go nowhere. You waste money, waste time, waste the resources. There has to be some level of out here. Refuse to make concessions beforehand, and they keep their cards close, so they don't telegraph, they don't give away their ideas. Keep maximum options open before negotiations. Operate in good faith. There has to be good faith. Good faith relates to the whole issue of trust. And I can stand here and talk to you about all kinds of negotiation, but if there's no trust, if there's no good faith, if there's no ability to really have a sound relationship with the people you're negotiating, it's really a problem. And state his or her position clearly as possible, but respect the opponents. I mean, that's just like it is in an athletic event. You know, present your team, present your capabilities, and then play the game and play it fair, play it clean, play it without any any bias. And then lastly, is fully briefed about negotiation. It has a good sense of timing and consent. That's that discipline, and that's that methodological approach we're talking about. That is, you know what the issues are. They have been thoroughly analyzed, and they've done the homework very thoroughly to understand that this is a very important agreement that has to be negotiated, and each side of the issue has been analyzed to give a good understanding of the elements that are going to make up an agreement if an agreement is achieved, and what is the downside if in fact there is any. Negotiation of Indians, for example, look for and say the truth, not afraid to speak up. They exercise self-control. They don't get upset. They don't get rambunctious. They don't get yelling and screaming. They're very, very emotional. Respect other parties. Look for solutions. Really nice. This is really nice. In my opinion, this is the essence. Looking for the solution. Trying to find a common ground, a meeting of the minds. And that is, in my opinion, the essence of what negotiation is all about. And they'll change their mind if, in fact, they see something that is not consistent. And lastly, they humble and trust opponents. How about the Arabs? Protect honor, respect, and dignity. That's why one has to know what the profile of those individuals are that are coming, those cultural profiles. And even the individuals, even though in a particular culture there are some values and beliefs that are non-negotiable, some individuals have other values that are important to think about. Avoid direct confrontation, you know, and sometimes in negotiation that's unavoidable, but this is something that in their style they have established as a means of making sure that they get what they want. Come up with creative, honorable solutions. I'll tell you, as a negotiator, I like those. Those are really nice. Come up with creative, honorable solutions. Solutions to problems rather than just getting something that's going to superficially satisfy what's going on. They want to have solutions, and I think that's a real admirable way to think about it. And are impartial and can resist pressure. You know, they're pretty linear, pretty straightforward. Nobody's going to twist their arm and corrupt them by giving them some other types of elements that are outside of the legitimate persuasion point of view, and can keep secrets, and they control their temper. All right? And then the Swedes, pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go over every element of those. Here's the Italians, have a sense of drama. Everything is a drama. And really that's a strategy in many cases. Even though it's part of their culture, they use it as a strategy to deal with it. Handle confrontation with subtle attacks. Managing the negotiation process. That's another element that we should be thinking about. We have to keep things objective. Even though we want to establish this trust, even though we want to understand each other's positions very thoroughly, and sometimes we think about trust as something that, boy, we got to become very, very good friends, like we're real buddies, or like we would be family. But we have to be objective about these elements too. You know, low context, high context cultures. In this particular example, low context Americans appear impatient, cold, and blunt to Americans. as opposed to Americans must approach negotiation with Mexicans with patience, refrain, and attacking. Remember, Mexicans are very passionate about what they're doing. They become very emotional. So they have to understand what their internal operations are when we're dealing with these particular pieces. So learn, beware of culturally based behavioral differences. We learned that in Chapter 3. Chapter 3 was very emphatic about those particular behavioral differences. And they are very obvious. It is a very understandable when you go into another culture or what's different. Many times we get into the self-referencing, that is, oh, it's about me, not about them. But when we go into another culture, it's got to be about them also. You have to be able to maintain your own point of view on things, but you have to understand that they have a point of view, and there has to be a meeting of the minds here. So the cross-cultural negotiation variables are pretty well established here. We have the goals, negotiating styles, and the composition of the teams, but those particular elements, those technical elements, the goals, the negotiating styles, and the composition of the team, are all affected by this cultural variable that's so complex. So, what do successful negotiators have? Well, consider a wide range of options, and they pay greater attention to areas of what we call the issue of common ground. I think I've used those two words very, very frequently here. Common ground. What can we meet on? What do we have that is common between the two parties? Tend to make twice as many comments regarding long-term issues. Long-term issues are issues that have to be thought about in terms of negotiation. We just don't negotiate something for tomorrow. We have to think about how is it going to impact our decision today, going to affect the long-term situation of the company. That's very, very important. And therefore, those who negotiate have to think about the long-term impact, because thinking it's going to happen just tomorrow is short-sighted. More likely to set upper limits and lower limits regarding specific points. Depends upon what really the goals are. We can't really quantify them until we know what the goals are, and therefore we have to be very task understanding. What are the tasks? What are the elements of the agreement we're trying to reach? This particular point, we're making a generous offer. Well, that's self-referencing again. That is, in your opinion, it's a generous offer, but from their point of view, maybe it's not very much at all, and that's relative to them. And to say that is somewhat condescending. All right, and then make counteroffer less frequently and use fewer reasons to back up arguments. You present the issue, present the ideas, present the suggestion, proposal to resolve that, and to come together with a understanding of how the agreement could be made. But don't constantly barrage your counterparts with all kinds of ideas that really are extraneous to some degree, just to try to overwhelm them. And then the last one is critically important. Active listeners are always important. And it's important to talk. It's important to have a dialogue or interactive discussion and communication with all the people. But it's also critically important to sit still and listen to what other people are saying also. So using the internet, that can be something that's important. The web application and the negotiation support system, they can be critically helpful in terms of giving information, and they can become a very important communication mechanism to really accelerate the process of negotiation in order to get the communication process going. Right? And then e-negotiation, the element here of speed, less travel. You can have a conference call, and I've been in situations where you can have 3 or 4 people around the table. In some cases we had 5, and have that particular individual team at another end from another country and talk on a conference call. We've had situations where We've been here in the U.S. and other people in China, other people in Europe, and depending upon the time of day, had a mutual discussion, all by electronic means, all by internet and telephone communication relationships. So they have real advantages. So learning the complexity of negotiation with the Chinese, that's something that you have to really sit down and think about. You have to see what the profile of those individuals are and think about these elements, the antecedents, the negotiating process, and the international business negotiator. We think about the antecedents. What precedes even before you get together in a table where you negotiate those particular elements? The etiquette, the harmony, the face, the negotiator's profile. How much do they know? How smart do you think they are? What are their particular characteristics in terms of how they have negotiated in the past? Maybe you can get some understanding of how they negotiated contracts in the past. Problems that we see with the Chinese. One, Chinese desire for details. Again, back to that discipline. They are very focused, and the more details they have, that becomes important for the opponents to really think about how we're going to deal with the details, because the Chinese will pull out all the elements and be very methodical and detail oriented. And if the opposing party doesn't understand how they deal with using the details as a strategy for negotiation, they're going to have a real problem. Saving face is really important in Chinese negotiation. You never want to go away from a negotiation with the Chinese where they've lost face. That will be the end of any type of relationship with them. The importance of harmony, Guanzai and Guanzhou networks, those are important elements. Comparing management and practice patience, accept prolonged stalemates. It's a strategy. Stalemate means you stop and they don't move on particular issues. And therefore, one is going to have to figure out how to get them out of these particular states. Refrain from exaggerated expectations. Don't think, well, going in, these people are smart. They understand how certain negotiated processes are going to operate. So we'll just go forward without them being totally involved. And once they really realize how good a deal we're giving them, they'll come aboard. That's not the reality. Establish a contact in China. I think that's the first thing you do in any situation. If you're going to negotiate with any different culture, it's critically important. It's imperative that you have a sense of what the geography is, what the details are, and have somebody there who really knows the inside and out of that particular environment. And remember to save face. Conflict resolution, many times, and probably more often than not, there are conflicts in negotiation, but they have to be resolved so you can get back to getting the job done. The instrumental-oriented conflict, to negotiate on the basis of future information and logical analysis, and the expressive account, to handle situations indirectly or implicitly. And those are particular expertise that we don't have enough time to go into at the present time, but we have to know that they exist and that we can find other materials and other training programs that would allow us to deal with those particular areas. Negotiation conflict between low context and high context cultures, as we talked about in Chapter 3, what a low context culture behavior is versus a high context. The negotiation process is different, and therefore the negotiators have to pitch their relationship and their negotiating style based upon understanding that. And it shows here what really those elements are. I'm not going to repeat them. We had them in Chapter 3. You can see what they are also. The last pieces here relate to some of Hofstadter's point of view in terms of individualism, collectivism, the objective, subjective issues, risk tolerance, and uncertainty and familiarity. These are really important elements to think about, because decision making is the final piece of this negotiated process. Because once you come to some agreement, you have to make decisions on how you're going to implement, how you're going to really take this agreement in and make it really operational. And therefore, the decision-making process in relationship to the culture becomes really important. Again, understanding what the variables are and how they influence this mapping gives you a pretty good idea of the interacting parts here. And those interacting parts are important to think about because they become focal points in terms of how you strategically deal with making sure that people want to participate in the agreement or in the negotiating process. And they could be critically important in terms of really closing the deal. All right? And then the last one, be familiar with Japanese decision-making process. This is something that would take a variety of ideas to really get into it. I'm not going to hold you responsible for all of these because they're somewhat complicated and it would be a whole course. But I just want you to be familiar with some of the elements that relate to how Japanese deal with it. And this particular graph provides you with some of those elements. I want you to review it. I'm not going to hold you totally accountable for it, but I want you to know that the Chinese and the Japanese have some similarities in terms of discipline, but they also have the style and they have some other elements that are contrasting and generally different. Okay. So what can we conclude here? Managers need working knowledge of decision-making process, what their decision-making process is as a company, and how it relates to the negotiating process. Some people negotiate to a certain level, and then they have to go to another level in order to get the authority to go forward to the final closing of the deal. So understanding how that decision-making process in the company operates is critically important. And also it's important to understand the cultural variables. What are they? How do they impact upon the day-to-day dialogue, the day-to-day interaction of particular issues related to the topics and goals and negotiated concepts that are being developed? And the manager should prepare for and conduct negotiation with a cultural sensitivity. I think that's a given. Anybody who doesn't appreciate that is really kind of out of sync with what's going on from an international management point of view. Anybody who doesn't understand that cultural sensitivity is at the essence, at the core of what we're dealing with here, is really out of touch with international management. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've given you a pretty thorough understanding of what this process is. Negotiation is something that you will be encountering quite extensively as an international manager. You may be part of a team, you may be part of an analytical group that provides the information that is used in the negotiation process. You may be the chief negotiator. But you have to understand that the cultural piece is the most difficult piece of it all. Negotiation process can be taught. Developing strategies can be taught. But understanding the culture is much more complex. What are the behaviors that are driven from the culture, from the belief systems that exist in a foreign land? Those are elements that take time to really think about, and they have such an enormous impact upon the process of negotiation. So I leave you with those particular thoughts. We will review this again as we move along, and we will see that the negotiation process becomes part of the whole management process when we deal with hiring of employees, when we deal with particular proposals to move business operation from one particular venue to another, and when we bring new products to the front line, when we have to sell products to different cultural entities and cultural groups, all of this negotiation elements are critically important. I'd like to go back to the front piece of this discussion and go back to these 5 elements here. Remember we talked about there's 5 elements, and these are important for you to really think about and have a sense of what's going on. Whether you know how to deal with the Japanese and Chinese, those were just examples that showed you how some of the styles and some of the cultural elements have an impact upon the process. But you have to know what these 5 elements are: the preparation, the relationship building, the exchange of task-related information, persuasion, and concessions. Those are important, and you will see those in an exam situation. I guarantee that. And so you should have a sense of what they are, how they are part of the success of a negotiated process, and what are the ingredients each one requires to be successful in achieving an agreement. And not knowing those is going to be a recipe for disaster or recipe for failure. So I suggest and strongly suggest that you know what preparation is, what relationship building is, what exchange of task-related information, persuasion, and the concessions and agreement. Know those, know them thoroughly, what they are, what the pieces are that relate to those elements, and how they can be applied in a variety of situations. So that concludes my discussion here, this particular lecture about Chapter 5 on cross-cultural negotiation. An important chapter, a chapter that has tremendous value in your future business dealings and international management. I'll be posting in the discussion topics some questions related to this that you can respond to, and they will have both theoretical and application themes to them. Additionally, you have your regular chapter questions on Chapter 5 that you should do. This should reinforce it. This should give you some real capability of augmenting and reinforcing the learning that we have presented here. So, without any more discussion, I'm going to end this particular lecture, and if you have any ideas and if you have any questions, email me, and you know how to do that. So thank you for your time and attention. Okay.